Basically just going to have these panel members give an introduction on themselves, what their current lab looks like, and the experience they have as far as processing material goes at scale. And what I've done, or what we've done, is worked really hard to curate a panel that has a lot of diversity and a lot of experience, not only producing high quality craft, but also experience with much larger scale. So let's start with Rackums. Let's kick it off. Welcome Rackums to the fucking show. Let's go.
Check, check. How's everybody doing? So my name is Nick, otherwise known as Rackums. Been doing this for about 5-6 years, going on 7 now, I guess. My lab system and setup is hand washing in a 44-gallon stainless steel vessel from S9 Steelworks in Michigan. And I have a couple of other sets that I collect into as far as rinsing and collecting is concerned. 33-gallon and also 20-gallon vessels where I stack my bags at. Kind of not nano batch, but small batch in the sizes that I work with as far as my hash production is concerned. Switching over to the rosin side, I use a Triminator press, a double stack, where I can press anywhere between 5 grams at a time to 200 grams at a time, depending on what your input and throughput is. But yeah, that's pretty much how I started and where I'm at.
Oh, Spencer, can you tell us a little bit about where you're based and what your current lab setup looks like?
Is that working now? Oh, there we go. All right, yeah, my name's Spencer. I'm up in Bellingham, Washington, and run a company, North Sound Solventless. Our lab, we're running an Osprey. We've got a nice spacious setup. And yeah, just kind of running a homemade nest with that. And that's, yeah, kind of the base of our equipment. And I'm sure we'll get into some more stuff later. But.
Beautiful. Lindsay, you have a tremendous amount of experience. I'm really excited. You just want to switch your mics off. You have a tremendous amount of experience. Lindsay LaBelle is a wealth of knowledge and very soft-spoken, but has processed an extremely significant amount of grams of hash in both spaces in our industry. So I'm going to pass it off to Lindsay to talk a little bit about the scale that you've worked at.
Okay, great, thanks. My lab is in about 150 square foot freezer.
You got to hold right close.
Sorry. My lab's in about a 150 square foot freezer. And in that space, we have an Icon 200 with a very unique water capturing system. And we also have a hand wash system that I designed that processes about 60 kilograms a day. So that's in 8 hours with 3 guys.
Can you talk a little bit about the experience you have had on other systems and in the past? If everybody checks their mics, we got one. Seems like we got some. Oh, okay, it's all good. He's got it. We're on it. Yeah, do you want to just talk a little bit about the scale that you've worked at and the experience you have?
Yeah, so if we wash 150 Monday, Tuesday, by Friday we've squished and jarred everything for curing. So it's about 1,500 grams for 3 people every week. That's a pretty decent sized week for us. That's a pretty decent week for us. Sorry, I've designed the Icon so that when you dump it, instead of having one bag capture 1.5 kilograms of heads, I spread it between 3 bags, and those are 64 gallon barrels, tanks, and in those tanks is a cage system that holds my bag up so that the bag can drain most of the way, so my guys aren't breaking their back. But there's also enough water in there to maintain temperature of the heads and keep them wet. Besides, not breaking their backs, pulling bags. It allows them to process it faster, so they're right in there right away, pulling bags and moving them over to the brute to rinse the heads. So we're doing say 12 cycles a day, or three washes of 4 each.
That's awesome. Those are sorry. No, I don't believe that to be hand wash. Oh.
That's the Icon 200. Yeah, hand wash, we do 4 a day, 15 kilograms each, so 60 kilograms. Yeah.
Big numbers. Mike, aka Faro Farms, aka El Hasho, you are a pioneer in Canadian solventless. You started on a very small press. You are the man behind big rosin in Canada, the first rosin to hit the market, make a big splash. You were there, ground zero, looking at true scale. What inputs, thoughts, or observations did you make there?
Hello? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, New York, for having us. Thank you, Jameson.
Give it up for Mike. Give it up for El Hasho.
This isn't an easy industry to get respect in. New York's not an easy city to get respect in, so thank you for having the Canadians here. I was early into the Canadian legalization. I think I've been making hash since like 09, 10. Did a lot of training in California, Colorado, etc. I think scaling in Canada just comes down to the fact that certain numbers are much lower in purchasability or even SKU availability in Canada. So as opposed to here, I think the numbers are a lot easier to hit. It was easy for us to scale up. We did it with 65-gallon Brutelesses at the beginning. Then we got an Osprey, then we got an Icon. I've worked for a bunch of Canadian companies. It's a long lineage, but you pretty much used everything. And I think the biggest problem for me, especially where we work, was room temp. Getting that, just like the growers always say, getting your space dialed in, I think, is the most important thing for us, and that was the hardest for us. HVAC, for some reason, costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to put into buildings. And moving water, the city ordinance, etc. So moving water around was always a pet peeve of mine. I figured that out now, and I've seen some Canadian success in our small 4 years. But if I'm being honest, I trained here in the States and just stole everything I learned. So my whole blueprint is thanks to like resin. Man, I could go on forever. But thank you to you guys for letting me steal your shit 5 years in advance and playing like it was mine in Canada.
Big shout out to Hasho. Adam, you are very outspoken in the community. You stay up to date on things. You run a very active Discord with a lot of hash makers that are talking about hash 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you're participating there as well as maintaining a pretty strong Instagram presence. So talk to us a little bit about your current setup and your workflow.
Can you hear me? So thank you guys all for coming, by the way.
Give it up for Adam. Come on, let's hear it.
So Han and I are caregivers in the great state of Maine. Shouts out to Maine. We're lucky enough to do work out of our home. So our garage is our lab. So we have a pretty standard, little smaller than 2-car garage that we built about an 8 by 9 foot cold room into. We keep it pretty simple with a 15,000 BTU AC with the CoolBot. We've been rocking the hashtag 50A setup for almost like 3.5, 4 months now. Pretty solid. Caching it through 20-gallon bags, squishing it on a low temp plate, 4 by 6. Yeah. Just keeping it pretty simple. Just trying to get through what our growers have for us.
All right, so before I open it up to questions, I have a topic that kind of surfaced in the last talk that I think deserves some attention in our industry from some heavy hitters. What are your thoughts when it comes to determining an industry standard on referring to yields as they pertain to fresh frozen or dry weight versus the issue that I'm getting at is that do you feel that there are too many variables within the fresh frozen process to be able to accurately standardize yields within our industry when we're referring to that? Adam, you're shaking your head. What? Go ahead.
Yeah. I just think it's like with people pulling such different bag sets and people washing for different amounts of time and just the differences in genetics. Like I've had people who tell me, their yield to hash, but they only include their premium like dabbing spectrums. When people ask me, I tell them, our total hash yield, and then it's like a longer discussion after that about like, oh, okay, so that yielded like 6%, but like what percent of the 6% was in your 90 to 150, and like what percent was in your, how much of it yielded on your first wash compared to your last like 3 or 4. I think it just goes back, you got to educate the people and have more in-depth conversations, because I feel like trying to just put a simple number on it, it will always it's just trying to like dumb it down, and you'll never get the full picture overall.
Hasho?
First of all, shout out Hashtag, because that is actually my newest. I have everything, I told you. They're also Canadian. I'm biased, but it is the best one I've used of the icon. It's just that I'm going to keep it 100 with you guys. I still have a black market lab, so I just didn't think to say that. But hey, listen, it is what it is. We got to eat. So, I mean, the easy answer for that is it's impossible. Adam touched on it. It's impossible to standardize, because what are you pulling for? What are you washing for? If you're washing just for input and pulling one bag, like I still talk to hash makers all the time, and this isn't like a disrespect to anybody. We all do everything differently, but I'll talk to hash makers on a daily basis, and I'm like, well, what are you doing with your garbage bags? What, like your first 2 bags that you're pulling, are you like washing through them? Are you pulling them out? And to me, it's insane the amount of people that say, well, yeah, I just spray through them. And I'm like, well, why are you chasing through garbage? What are you chasing for in that garbage that you're trying to inherently take out? What are you spraying through for? Why don't you just take that out, add it to input, add it to a 20U? Like, so how do you standardize when you really don't know what each individual company is pulling for? Or it's just a hard one, right? And then
It's huge, and I mean, I want to dive into it because we're trying to find some metric as an industry standard to compare and transfer information between each other for mutual benefit or not. But when we can't compare apples to apples, what is the right way that you guys on the panel see this unfolding? Spence?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna look at this kind of from 2 ways. So, from the first way, when we're just a processor, we don't have a cultivation piece. So I'm looking at a lot of different farms. I'm looking at a lot of different material, and I hear a lot of, bro, this one's gonna do 8%, 7%, 5%, and then I get my hands on it, and it's like 3%, 4%. So, and I've had same strains from the same farm do different batch to batch too. So from a sourcing standpoint, I think it's really hard to trust people when they say this does this when you're not the one that grew it and you're not the one consistently running those strains. So for me, kind of like Kaya said earlier, I like to just get my hands on 1,000 grams and run it
Close to your face.
and see what it actually does. Sometimes I'll do jar tests, but not really to get a yield out of anything. It's maybe I'm looking at 10 different strains and I want to see how they do next to each other and maybe get an idea of what really not to do. More so than say like, oh, I'll try to look at this jar and that's going to be a 4 or 5%. Like that's really hard to do unless you're really good at it and you run those same strains and do it a lot. So from a sourcing standpoint, I really like to run things myself and get my own numbers, and then what I'm including in my yield numbers when I talk to people is what my usable rosin is. I end up with a lot of food grade that I give away or I cook into edibles and give to people and whatever, but it typically is not going into like a sellable jar that we're, putting on the shelves or whatever. So I really like looking at yield from a usable end product standpoint. So for me, that's like, whatever your premium spectrum is, that's going to end up ultimately in the hands of the customer is what I kind of consider in my yield. So,
Nick, what do you think?
I think there's also a disconnect too that's going on when you hear people talking about how much they yielded as far as a percentage is concerned, 5%, 6%, 8%, whatever. you're not really sure right off the bat if they're talking about the whole spectrum of hash that they collected from that 25 or 45 micron and all the way up, or if they're talking about the specific microns they use to turn that hash into rosin, if that's the direction they're going. On top of that, there's starting to become an industry standard, I would say, as far as the input amount of wet weight to dry weight, which is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but 2250 roughly. I know Cuban Grower is one of the ones that kind of put that on the map. It's kind of a rough number. It's because every plant weighs different, and every batch is going to weigh different based off that water weight. So already right there, and also we were talking about earlier on the other panel with if you harvested while the plants were wet. Now you're adding that much more weight into the bag, so you really don't know exactly how much plant matter and water weight there is next to each other. So that's just kind of like a rule of thumb, that 2250 number. You figure every 2250 grams that you have, that equals roughly about 454 dry grams, or a single pound. But I feel like there needs to be a more of an open discussion when it comes to the yields that somebody's getting. If I'm saying I'm getting 5%, it's total yields, like Adam said. And that's from everything that I collected altogether. And the reason that percentage is used is for the farmer. And also, if you're growing or if you're processing specifically for hash or melt, then that's going to be your end number, your final yield. But if you're going into rosin, then you have that formula that you have to account for too. How much of a percentage of that came from the input material as well? So there's technically two types of formulas that you have to worry about: the hash input from the material, flour input, and the rosin output from that same material. If you're in a legal lab, I know that you're going to want to worry about your end result being the rosin more so, and what that's producing from the material that you're inputting, and maybe less of the hash. But as a farmer or a hash maker, that hash yield is always going to be most important, unless you're going to post-process into rosin or something else.
Lindsay, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know that you could make it the same across the industry, but you could do yourself a favor and try and make it the same for you every time you're harvesting it. So SOPs, standardizing exactly what you're doing from the front to the back end of the whole process. We do mostly toll processing, so we once took something, washed it, came back like weight to weight volume, 6% yield. I know the grower, there's no way that's happening. So dug into it a bit more with the grower, found out he stopped feeding it 2 days before and plants were dry, right? So you have to standardize it, and you have to know what the people you're working with are doing in order to be on the same page and have numbers that mean something.
100%, 100%. Anyone want to jump in before we move on? Take it away, Adam.
I totally agree with what Lindsay was just saying, because in the same vein, like I've had a grower who dropped off GMO and it yielded 12%, and I hit him up and was like, do anything differently this round? He was like, oh yeah, well, it dried on the vine a little bit, so like those numbers might not be extremely accurate. So it's you got to be careful when people are telling you numbers. And I feel like when people are trying to like pump up their yields, like I feel like people are getting too caught up in how much something can produce and not necessarily if that's like quality. Like I'd rather a 3%er that's fire and sells out immediately over like a 5 or a 6%er that's the same played out terp profile as all the other people washing it, because it does 5 or 6%. And it's like, if you wash it, you're gonna end up with more of it, and it's probably not gonna move as well as the 3%. So now you're not even making as much money off of it when you got to do price adjustments. So I feel like the yields are not the full story.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you guys see when either yourselves scaled up or clients that you're working for are scaling up? Rackams?
The biggest hurdle, in a sense?
Challenges, hurdles, or common issues. What were the
One of the
point
biggest ones is for farmers that don't know how to post-process their material for hash at harvest. Like that post-processing part of it for post-harvest post-process seems to be the hardest. I mean, if you don't talk to your farmer and you're not connected with them the way that you should be, you could potentially get all your material completely ruined to the point where you're losing a decent amount of percentage, and just because you didn't have that conversation. So the post-harvest process is crucial. I mean, in my opinion, that's one of the biggest hurdles.
What about you, Spence?
Yeah, I'll kind of to add on to that one. I mean, become good friends and treat your farmers with respect and kindness. I spend a lot of time in the couple of gardens that we work with, and I'm super fortunate that they let me come down there and do that. And I spend a lot of time teaching those guys how to harvest, what to do. You know, we've brought freezers down there with racks that, you know, allow us to freeze stuff before it gets bagged, and you know, we've kind of helped them along the way. So, you know, like Nick said, it's, you know, making sure you have open communication with the people that you're working with, trust each other, and be 100% honest with them too. You know, as a processor, you're starting off kind of a losing battle because at some point everyone's kind of been screwed along the road. So being honest and being upfront with your farmers and who you're working with goes a long, long way.
Lindsay, what about you?
This question.
Just, you know, when you're consulting either for others or experiencing it yourself, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you're experiencing as you scale up into a larger commercial or more commercialized setting?
So I think when I'm working with clients, I think they're not understanding the market size, what they have to do. So they want to process a ton right away. And if you're in the Canadian system, I don't know about other regulated systems, but it's really hard to get into there. It's a 60-day process just to get one SKU. If you're not aware of all these little things that drive the market, you're going to be overestimating making a bigger lab than you need, maybe sacrificing on quality when you don't have to. So I think just knowing your market, what to expect from it, so that your equipment and your lab isn't over budget for something it doesn't need to be when it doesn't need to.
Sound advice. Hasho?
Sorry. I think the biggest hurdle I've ever faced is with scaling, or especially with LPs in Canada, licensed producers. Inevitably, you just have a lot of people working in those buildings from very secluded areas of Canada where there's otherwise not a lot of opportunity outside of like a coffee shop or a local restaurant. So you're not necessarily working with people whose lives surround cannabis. They don't love it. They're not happy to be part of this new hash program. It's also new that they're like, most of the buildings I've gone into, they're like, we're going to be making what? We're going to be doing what? So it's really hard to explain to them like why it's so important that they're processing it a certain way, or it has to be in the 5-gallon bucket, then in a bag, and then you give it to partner B and they put it in the freezer right away, and 300 grams per bag, never more than 7. Like, you're working in certain spaces where you're really micromanaging, and that's the hard part for me.
For sure. Mission, I know you do a lot of consulting. What about you? What have you seen?
I would say that the biggest hurdles probably are getting them with the right genetics probably first, because most of the time they're hoping whatever they're running for flower will wash. I mean, it usually doesn't. I feel like also it's like if you go into somebody where they're growing for flower and they want to start a solventless program, it's not like the easiest transition, just because the things that you're growing for flower are not what you're looking for when you're growing for hash necessarily. Like, you know, we don't really care about biomass yield or the looks or the structure. We're really looking for what's tasty, what's got the greasy heads, what can wash, what like works well in our systems. So trying to, like, I guess, manage their expectations almost on like what their first couple rounds of product will be like, and then harvesting for sure, because harvesting is usually one of those things where it's not on the hash people, it's on the cultivation side, and you know, those people are usually hourly or they're getting paid by weight sometimes, so they're really just trying to fucking turn and burn through fresh frozen harvest. Like, when I was working in Rhode Island, I would sit with the trimmers and trim with them, and some of them would try to clown me because I would do like half of what they did in the same period, but then I'd fucking ask to see their gloves, and their fingertips are caked with heads, and I'm like, well, that's where my money's going. Like, that's why I take my fucking time with it. So just getting people to care and take the care with the product and handling and getting it cold as quickly as you can, trying not to jostle it as much, keeping it cold. So I think those are probably the two hardest things to instill into new people.
I would say with that too, we hired a legacy team. Every hash maker I had been doing it for 3-4 years, and that made a huge difference when we're trying to scale up and we're running into issues. I think that made a really big difference in terms of what ideas are on the table to overcome it. Like for example, we had a wedding pie that was super greasy coming out of the freeze dryer, so we couldn't sift it or bag it normally. We had to make little hash bricks, slide them in, sort of like the jungle tech stuff you see. That was the first time we ran into it. So having a team of experienced guys was there to solve it fast. Yeah.
Gonna open it up for questions, guys. Go ahead.
We're talking about yields and everything. Maybe this is for a different topic, but going into spraying and washing, in my experience, like really cleaning the bags, having more product in the bag, you have to clean up, you have on that, but also how can you overwash, kind of going into that.
Que-
Yields and I realized that I wasn't washing. Maybe I was washing now, but washing through the bags well enough when I was loading.
Question for the panel is about overwashing. What's their experience about affecting yields with overwashing or overspraying? Who wants to start this off?
I'll go for it.
Go ahead.
One thing we do with every pull is I have a microscope in the lab and a whole bunch of glass slides. In every pull, I'm sampling this, looking under the scope. Am I pulling up trichome stalks? Am I pulling up green material? Or is it just heads? And then you can dial your equipment accordingly and your temperatures.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I'll kind of tap in on the other side of that, of the spraying the heads. I like a lot of pressure, with the exception of maybe like the first couple bags. Like I might gently spray the outside and try and get any heads that are stuck to the sides to fall down in there. And then I'm gonna pull my 220 or whatever. But those premium bags, I want like a good amount of pressure on there. Like you want to wash the shit through that. I see a lot of videos.
Don't
and
be
stuff.
afraid
It's
of the
like
pressure.
It's like a little, like a little dick trickle on there.
You
And it's
want
like,
your yields to be affected.
So I want clean hash, so I want pressure in there pushing any contaminant and any crap that's not getting caught in those first trash bags to get pushed through to that 25U bag, which is trash anyways. So I want, my 120, my 90, and my 73 or whatever, I want to spray those pretty good because I want to capture the actual heads that are getting stuck in that bag.
Question was about 6-star and pulling melt, and would you apply the same amount of pressure spraying those heads for rosin as you would for melt? Go ahead.
Question back. So if this just goes for me, but if I'm ever gonna, in the Canadian system, like I'm very outspoken about the fact I will not even try and produce melt that's ever gonna go to market. Our path to market is absolutely ridiculous. From the moment a product's done till it gets to the province or like the federal hands and then to the custom, like you could never sell melt and look somebody in the face and be like, I do this because I love it. I'm not just a piece of shit. So, well, if that's funny, fucking stick around. Second show. So if I was gonna produce melt, again, the pressure comment, I would assume if I was gonna answer would be about pushing through a ton of material, like on a work day. If you're doing melt, especially speaking just for Canadians, you're probably doing it for a reason, like a contest or something. In that case, I'm running such little material that I'd want so little pressure. And I'd play with the bag more rather than just directly try and push through it, which is another reason that I always pull my garbage bags. And if I'm losing in that spray through of my 220 or 190, I'm willing to lose that. Because at the end, I'll put it into a separate garbage bag for the whole day. At the end, I'll garbage bag, garbage pail. At the end of the day, it's developed so much water and just soak through from being pulled. I'll just separately put that through like a set of 5-gallon bags, and it goes to the dudes in the lab. So, you know, there's a time for pressure and there's a time for not. Is my answer, anyways.
Even with the melt, in my opinion, I would worry more about the amount of rinsing you're doing versus the amount of pressure you're using for that rinsing. A short rinse, whether it's little or a lot of pressure, could still hurt you because you just didn't rinse it out that properly. And it's not even just contamination; it's also heads that were stuck together or smaller heads that got stuck on the 90 that didn't drop through because you didn't use enough pressure or enough water or rinse long enough. My main focus when it comes to rinsing is making sure that if I feel like I'm done rinsing, keep rinsing for another 30 seconds to a minute, like just to make sure.
And make sure your temperatures are always cold as possible.
Cold as fuck.
But yeah, I'll kind of do the same pressure. But if I'm like specifically making melt, I'm kind of just looking for like the bubbles or the contaminant on top of that bag. As soon as that sinks through and that's gone, that's when I'm kind of calling it on the spray factor. You know, scoop that out and you got some little bubbles and contaminant, little white foam. I want all that to get kind of worked out of the bag, and then I'm pulling it. So I'll kind of use the same pressure, maybe a little lighter, you know, always a little gentler with the melt, but that's kind of how I do it.
With the melt too, I mean, if you want the best of the best, I guess you grab the first 5 minutes, right? Like, don't expect to have the same at the end of a wash as you do at the beginning. Isn't my thought. That's super small batch. Now you're talking like Percy.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit to terminology and ask the panel a bit of a broad question, but do you think that cold cure is too broad sweeping a terminology for our industry at this point?
When does the cold cure end is a good question.
I'm not here to answer any questions. I just asked them.
What did you say? When does cold cure end? I mean, you could bring in...
Like, is cold cure too broad sweeping a question? Like, do we need to better delineate between that, or is that something that...
I used to cold cure on my Xbox in like 2011, 2012.
So that's
yes. I'm dead serious. And if you knew me back then or talked to me back then, it was all because of this company from California called Resin, R-E-Z-N, and they did these coins. And at the time, you could literally like flip them around, chunk them off. I thought it was the fucking dopest shit ever. And the only way I could make them was by laying parchment out on my Xbox, pressing out little coins, and leaving them overnight. And it was just enough subtle heat that it would turn it but not burn it. And I was like, well, all right, I'm the fucking Xbox curator now. And so like if people used to cure on lizard mats because you could control the temperature and it would stay under 100 and blah, blah, blah. Like, is there a right or wrong way? And like, you're not curing in the cold. You're curing at room temperature. Maybe you're shocking it for a couple days in the cold, but everybody's like, put it in the freezer, put it in the fridge.
I think
Show
that's
me
where
a
it gets
scientific...
I think that's where it gets misconstrued, is the fact that people say it's a cold cure, but they're not defining what their definition of cold cure is. Was it a room temperature cool cure? Was it in the fridge that's 40 to 50 degrees for a month to 2 months? Was it in the freezer for 6 months and finally nucleated? I mean, that's what we're doing here. It's a nucleation process, right?
And
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you're doing production for customers and you need to reach deadlines, it's really tough. Is this going to be a six-week cure or a 2-week cure? Like, it's tough to know when that's done.
And that's the thing about it. The true cold cure will take that long unless it just happens to pop off. You just found a genetic that will nucleate and cold cure or whatever naturally within 24 hours, even at 55 degrees. But that doesn't really happen that very often. Most products will stay somewhat stable. And by introducing, pretty much if you're introducing any type of heat, it's not a cold cure.
But what we're doing is looking for the nucleation, and with the right amount of heat, I think speeding up the nucleation process, if you can control it and you've dialed that tech in, there's no difference.
No.
You're not burning
speeding up the process.
100%.
And for LP or a white market brand, that makes sense.
Thank you. Lizard mats.
It has to, but a
Just
black
puts you on
market
game.
traditional brand can obviously take the time if they want to properly do a cold cure. But I think we just need to be more open about what the term means and how we're using it.
And there's no extra value in a cold cure in Canada. Again, just opinion. You're not going to get any extra value at retail level for having a 30-day cure. Our economy, our education, our level is nowhere near there yet.
Our inputs.
Our inputs are nowhere near there yet. That's just a lost conversation. But like the people in this room are like 1% of 1%. You know, I always say like never base your opinion on an outlier. Like your kid could be Michael Jordan, but there's only been one. Like fuck, I hope for him, but let's just not be super disappointed if, you know. So I don't know. It's really tough, you know.
What about fresh press? Like, do you think that there's a big enough difference between fresh press immediately consumed off the press and say non-nucleated resin that has been contained as fresh press for multiple days at a time?
You get some flack if you call it fresh press and it stays in the OCS for a month.
Yeah, I think that, you know, Canada's behind on their distribution systems, but I think just from a terminology standpoint, like, do you feel as though things need to be further separated like that, or do you think that you know, that's kind of nitpicky? Adam, I saw you shake your head down there. What do you think?
I do not see the benefit of fresh press for anybody personally. If you're a producer, makes your packaging more difficult, your storage more difficult, your transportation more difficult. If you've ever given your average consumer a gram of fresh press in a glass jar, they'll probably complain about losing half of it trying to get it out, just sharding and breaking it up. Some of the fresh press is like soft and you can kind of like spoon it out, but it's just, most of the time I smoke fresh press, I just really wish someone would let it butter up in a 1-zip jar instead of having your 1 gram. Because people who do fresh press try to say that, oh, but then you can control it yourself and you can batter it at your, but it's like, I'll tell you, like, curing 1 gram versus curing like 2 zips together, I think there's a big difference. Like, your terps are gonna evaporate way more in your 1 gram jar than in your bigger one. But that's just me. I'm a fresh press hater for the most part. There are some strains that come out good in fresh press, but like, especially from a producer and a consumer, I feel like it's just makes your life more difficult.
It's just a visual thing more than anything else at this point, especially for a white market standpoint. It's literally just a visual thing. Like, there's nothing really added or gained or even lost from fresh press. You don't. Downside is you have that jelly bean shell-esque on the outside of it, so it kind of traps in the terpenes a lot more. Maybe if you have a more complex, unique terpene, that'll express itself in the jar still. The majority of the time, it doesn't smell like it's going to smell after it's been cured or nucleated properly and then mixed together or whipped.
It's not winning competitions. I mean,
You ain't wrong.
I think it's cool that we have the ability to look. Like I was saying before, this is like 1% of 1%. The people in this room really fucking love this shit. Like, we're the, you know, like an outlier, like a skateboarder. 1% of 1% of the people want to do that. To be here, you put in effort. We're the people that are, you could sell me fresh press. I fuck with that. I want to do it myself. I want to see it change. I want to see it live. But what percentage of the market are we talking about, right?
Well,
and that goes back to us having this education that,
I think that us further discussing and defining this as a community and sussing it out allows us to mature and you know, ultimately grow the community, and maybe we'll be 2% one day. So I think, like, you know, talking about these things, but I know that there are people like yourself out in the crowd that I hold in very high regard that enjoy fresh press and think about it differently. And I think at some point it become a nuanced preference.
Once you see the resin cure and the way that it goes from fresh press to like its natural marbleization, it's a beautiful thing.
That's
yo.
my
And
favorite
I don't even smoke
consistency.
rosin. I don't even smoke rosin. I smoke melt, but I'm just saying it's still a beautiful thing to see that and to allow the consumer. I know it may be difficult to jar it, it may be difficult and all that, but as a consumer, that shit tastes better. It may be a little bit difficult. My wife smokes the rosin, so she doesn't like the fresh press because it's messy. He's straight up, she's like, I don't fuck with that. So I always got to cure the jar for her, you know what I'm saying? But still, like, as a consumer, I fuck with that fresh press so I can see that shit cure. And if it's already whipped and it's got to the point of of the kill cure, I feel like it's degradation. You're already causing it to degrade. And it's closer to degradation than it is. So you're giving us a product that's closer to degradation. So if I'm sticking it in the freezer and it's something that I really, really fuck with, I'm not trying to smoke it. I'm saving that shit for Christmas or New Year's or whatever the fuck about birthday and shit. So if it's like that, I want it fresh pressed so I can see that shit cured naturally. That's just my perspective.
I will say, like, I feel like the one thing, like, if a brand does do fresh press properly, then it's like, at least to me, it's like that's like a big thing, because it's like, oh, they really like, they have their SOPs from packaging and storage and transport, like, especially on the trap side. Like, if you can get me fresh press in good shape on the black market, like, it's pretty impressive. Like, dispensaries have freezers and refrigerators, and you usually like give them the lowdown on how to store your stuff. But
I think you just touched on something super important, and that's your distribution channel. So the distribution channel in Washington is different from Canada. Like, it's taking you guys forever to get it there. And for me, I can get it there really quick, but who knows how long it's gonna be kept there. And I don't know if they're keeping it long-term in a freezer or in a fridge, if it's temp controlled. There's so many variables. A lot of the outlets in Washington State don't handle it well. So for me, the fresh press works. I can get the product to them the best. So I think every situation is gonna call for something different. So just to throw that out there.
I do the opposite of Kaya, and mostly I do a lot of cold cures, but I'm also going to say this, like, not everything wants to cold cure into that, like, gooey, wet, nice, soft texture that everybody wants in that jar. Like, some stuff just won't do it. It'll be dry, it'll be crumbly. So it's like, to me, it's more like, yeah, if someone gives me a fresh press and it's like, it's terpy and it's fucking good and it hits right, like Mikey's MTS Farms and stuff back there, it's fire-ass fresh press. But for the most part, like, I also don't want dry-ass, crumbly cold cured, So for me, it's all about, like, reading that resin and knowing what that specific strain's gonna do, Like Kaya does fresh press. He's super lucky because he grows his own material and grows beautiful resin. So when his stuff marbles up in the jar, like Joseph was talking about, it's beautiful. And it doesn't take anything but scratching your dabber on it to get it nice and wet and gooey. And all of his stuff does that, and he knows that. So even if it does chalk out, it's good. Whereas I'm dealing with who grew what over here and over here and over here. Everything wants to do a little bit different. And when I get, recently we've been doing a lot of living soil stuff, and most of that does want to cold cure out nice and gooey, and it's fantastic. But a lot of stuff, like, we do add heat to some stuff here and there, especially when we're doing toll processing or a production split, because I don't want you guys getting dry, crumbly rosin or fresh press that's not going to stay glassy and then whip up into something nice and, like, a desired texture. So for me, it's like knowing your strain, knowing what it's going to do, and then kind of like treating that, like keeping a library of how things do, so you can look back on that and be like, this one comes out dry, I'm gonna add some heat to it, or no, this one cures out perfect, or this one's really good as fresh press. So for me, it's kind of reading the resin and knowing what to do with it.
Anyone want to jump in before next question? All right, we're gonna open it up. Next question, go ahead. Here, I got a mic for you.
I have a question about when it comes to, I do a lot of pheno hunts, and I don't necessarily have about like 1,000 to 2,000 grams of a specific strain to want to do a test wash of it. Is there any way to get to like a lower number than like 2,000 frozen? Something like a couple hundred maybe. Is there any way to reduce that to get to a specific math where you can pretty much wash like 150 frozen and then find out like if this is going to wash 4, 5, 6% or something like that, versus me having to waste 2,000 grams, which I might not be able to produce because I'm pheno hunting and not every plant is going to give me that much at the same time.
I mean, we talked a little bit about the jar test, and the basic numbers for that is if you put 20 fresh frozen grams into a mason jar and you get roughly about 1 gram back, that's 5%. And if you have the means to dry that hash from that mason jar, if you're able to collect it with the resin dial or some other form, or put it through bags or something, you can take that, dry it, weigh that, divide that by the 20 grams, you'll get your percentage, which if it's around a gram should be 5%. Then you can scale that up.
Can you always get the same variables whether the same everything that's the same temperature, the same size of ice is going to give you the same variable every time?
Ideally, yeah. I mean, you want to try to use the same parameters and inputs across the board, whether it's your water, your ice, and your material. It's always going to vary slightly, though.
Yeah, and scaling things down, like, yeah, put it in a 5-gallon bucket if you don't have 1,000 grams, but make sure your like water and ice and material ratios are like the same as you'd do in a bigger batch, because you don't want it all super soupy and you don't want it all chunked full of ice. So if you're scaling it down to do a micro batch, yeah, get a set of 5-gallon bags or whatever, but make sure your wash vessel you've got the right ratio of water and material and ice in there too. Kind of keep everything the same, like standardize it throughout the whole process, whether you're washing like 5,000 grams or like 500. So if you're doing it in a 32-gallon bucket, do it in a 5-gallon bucket, and keep everything kind of, ratioed the same.
A good rule of thumb for if you're going to wash it and or do a jar test, dry out your resin, paper towel or whatever you're going to do. But there's about generally a 60% loss between the freeze dryer and the water and a well-made tray. So that's one thing we do at our work is we really standardize how we make our trays. And that's 60% loss from the freeze dryer is like plus or minus 2%. Like we got it bang on.
Wow.
So if you can standardize the way you're making your trays, you'll get a better feel for the resin.
I think that's a gold bar. Go ahead, Adam.
We use like the jar test as like a yes or no test. So like if we're working with a grower and they've got like new strains, and I mean we've done a lot of them, so I sort of have like a visual bank in my mind of like what 1%, 2%, 5% looks like. So it'll take some time for you to just like do it enough to sort of see like, okay, this isn't a good yielder, this is an okay yielder, this is a great yielder. And then from there, you can decide if you want to freeze and wash your whole batch or just dry it instead. So that's what we do. And it's good. It saves you a lot of heartbreak. Like we've had people who have stuff where they're like, oh, this tests 35% and it's so frosty. And I'm like, that's cool. Put 20 grams in a mason jar and like shake it up and send me a picture. And then they send you a picture and it's just little wispy grains on the bottom instead of a nice like, if it's good, it should make like a full circle of resin. Like we don't dry it and weigh it usually unless it's like a really in-depth one. We usually just go by the picture that they'll send me of the bottom of the mason jar. So I know that if it's a full ring, that's a thumbs up basically. And we're using like the wide mouth pints and we're doing anywhere between like 15 to 20 grams. So
Is there math on you use the 20 grams frozen flour? So do you know how much ice you're using? Do you know how much water you're using? Down to the ratio, or is it just all by eye that you do it?
when I do my jar tests at home, it's the same thing. It's 3 cubes, it's a cup of water, it's the 20 grams frozen. We shake it all for the same amount of time. We let it all sit for the same amount of time. Because that's like, you want to let it sit for at least like an hour, maybe like 2 hours, because that'll let all the heads settle and fall to the bottom. Like if you just shake it up and you let it sit for 10 minutes, there'll be something on the bottom, but there'll still be lots of stuff like floating. So giving it the time to let it settle so you can really see how it does. But if you can, like being able to dry it after the fact, like if you have access to a resin dial, it will really bring your pheno tests up to the level where you can be like, okay, this yielded well, and then you can get like 1 or 2 dabs off of it and be like, I like this pheno tastes better than that pheno, even though this pheno might have a little bit more hash in a jar. So
Can I answer this one quick?
Yeah. I just want to make an announcement. Yo, guys, we got a lounge in the back. If you want to chop it up, you are more than welcome to chop it up in there. We appreciate you. Go ahead, my dog.
I mean, this might sound weird, but when I learned the jar tech years and years ago, I don't remember who I learned it from, but I crush the ice and I build the mason jar like I would build my wash vessel. So I put a little bit of ice at the bottom, then my 20 grams, then I cover the top with ice as if I'm building like a little sewer grate. Then I fill the water. I treat it exactly like I'm gonna go in on a wash, but I just shake real gently for about 3 minutes to 5 minutes. And I literally just look for what Adam does. So I literally try to rebuild my actual wash in that jar. So I never, to be honest, I might be the only one up here that's never written down a number. I don't know what my ratio is. I just eye it. I break the buds up like I would. I treat it exactly as I would a wash, like as seriously, but I just don't write the numbers down. I just look for the density of the heads and if they stick. And I let it sit for about an hour, yeah.
We got time for a couple more questions. Go ahead, my G.
I'm on live right now, and someone asked me, the homie asked what your opinions are on washing with the jacketed vessels and no ice inside of them, right? Just keeping it at the vessel at 35 degrees or under. What's your opinion? Are you guys about that? Are you guys against it? What's
There's a few ways to do that if you don't want to use a jacketed system in a chiller, because that gets expensive. And people may or may not like this, but if you recycle your water, you maintain a good temperature. So what I would do sometimes is go in the morning, fill up my icon for the guys, put my ice in it, run it for 10 minutes, let the ice melt, and then you have your base temperature, and then that way you're not. And then we would recycle the water. Make sure you're rinsing your heads with clean water. Give them a good rinse. But if your water's not getting too dirty and you use it over, again, clean it really well, rinse it really well. But that's a good way to maintain the temperature of the water and using minimal ice. No ice. And not having to jacket it. I've seen jacketing where the flour gets stuck to the side of the vessel if you're running naked, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that too. We run an Osprey and it's insulated. It's not jacketed. I've never run one with it jacketed, but I have run it without ice. Just when our cold room's at 40 degrees, and yeah, you just want to make sure your water that you're putting into the vessel is just as cold as you can get it. We've got two 300-gallon water tanks, and one of them's got kind of a makeshift lid with the top cut off, so we can just dump clean ice right into the top of that thing and fill it, and it just floods over into the next one. So that one's got a bunch of ice in it, it's got a big PVC bulkhead, and as it fills, it just runs over into one that doesn't have ice in it. And then we use that to either fill the Osprey, but I personally do like ice. I like a little bit in there. I don't know why. It's just a security blanket or whatever. If I have a bag of ice and a good size load in the Osprey and it spins for me, you can watch the temperature just drop. So I just like keeping it cold. I think more so than, what I've liked better than running no ice is just running the thing in one direction. But maybe a different discussion.
No, Adam, jump in, and then we're going to circle back.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on the no ice is like, I could go either way. I like ice. I don't really see the reason why. But the jacketed units that I've seen, and we've talked about it in our Discord group and whatnot, but a lot of these dudes who are running like glycol chillers, like they will build up ice in a ring right around where the glycol is getting pumped, and like it just builds out. And it, you'll see plant material stuck on it, which I would almost assume means that there's going to be trichomes stuck on it. So I'm not personally a fan of those chillers because I just see, and I've never used them once again because we ball on a budget here at Mission Hill Melts. But like, if you can really tune the temperature so it's not like so freezing cold that it develops that ice ring and like just cold enough that it keeps it at like that 32 level, then, but I see more people getting way more ice accumulation than I'd want. So I'm not personally a fan of those, but somebody wants to send me one to fuck around with, can work that out.
I want to circle back to two things that were talked about. First thing was reusing your water in your cycles. How many of you are reusing your water, and how many of you are changing your water out each time?
I change my water out every watch. I'm curious to have a question in regards to that as far as water saturation. Like, there's a certain point where water can only hold so much solid, correct? Do we know what that percentage or number is, and can we base that off of? Can we input that to all those microns you keep just getting built up and more and added into that water and then the wash?
Yeah. So
every time.
Let me start by saying the reason we do it is because I'm not on a city water thing. We have to have a guy come and pump our water out. So when you're going through 1,500 gallons a day or whatever, that becomes costly and like, yeah.
Close to your face, Lindsay. Right close, like right close. No, right. Yeah.
Okay.
The mic.
Did you guys hear that?
The people want to hear you in the back, man.
So that's what causes us to use it. So you could on the fourth wash use fresh new water. I just find at the size we're doing, I'm not cooling the water on the way in. I'd love to figure a system that does that without freezing it. Cooling it on the way in, but I do find it's great when I'm recycling the water that I maintain temperature pretty well, constant, and always dip your thermometer in or take
Yeah, if you don't
temperature
have a way to
readings.
properly chill your water, that makes sense to recycle your water because it's going to keep it at a lower maintained temperature. So that makes sense. And also your water usage or consumption. I mean, those two reasons make sense to recycle your water, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it depends on your situation. Sorry, Chad, hold on, but I think it depends on your situation too. Like I'm blessed. We can walk outside in Western Washington on a sunny day, and you can, your rain bucket will fill up. So our lab's in an old dairy barn. We've got tons of access to water, and our big floor drains go right back into the groundwater system. So I don't feel bad about having fresh water every wash. Now, if you're somewhere else, you might want to be a little more conscious about that. But for me, in our situation, it just goes right back into the groundwater, into the water table, and then gets repumped back up after it's filtered. So I think a lot of it depends on where you're at and how your setup is, and what your water supply is like. Do you have good water, bad water?
Adam, did you want to jump in?
If we're doing like a batch, like if we're washing GMO, we use the same water from the first wash to the fourth or fifth wash. We don't switch water out. Part of that is just because I don't want to waste water. Like, we work out of our home, so I'm running my well and my pump. So if I'm dumping 30, 40 gallons of water after every wash, like I'm putting strain on my infrastructure, which I'm not trying to do. And also I put a lot of focus on like our rinsing reservoir and like spraying shit down. And like, we've got a really heavy duty water pump. So we spray down so much water through our bags that there's basically none of the water that we washed it in when I scoop it onto the tray. So you're not like, even though that water might be like dirty, it might be green, it might have some like dust and like the weird particulate, but we spray so much water through that it's not staying around at least in our premium bags, maybe in like the 45, but yeah.
So question for the reused water, something that emphasis on in Hawaii and like keeping the temperature. My understanding with running the Osprey, kind of running the Osprey and watching the temperature with a temp gun, the science behind that of like structural change or whatever fucking happens in science of temperature change going up that affects the hash, even if you're doing a couple degrees. And that's why even going down, I feel like that change is something that affects the heads as opposed to just keeping it consistent, like you're saying with your SOPs all the way through. But I'm asking, going back to the point of reused water. I've heard different theories on it, a lot of different things, but like also when you need to reuse the water, like how you filter that to your part of the question of its ability to still hold and catch, or like where that is. So I don't know if anybody has different insights of where they pump from as opposed to the top of where they're holding that water and storing it at a cold temp. I heard at a different seminar, a guy was saying that a lot of that matter sits to the bottom, so you don't want to pull directly from the bottom and you reuse that water because there's still stuff sitting in that. Other guys, like, you're washing through it anyway, don't worry about it with your clean water. I was just wondering, kind of seeing when you're reusing that water, what is like any suggestions of getting the cleanest water out of that reused water, or cleanest part of that? I don't know.
That's gotta be you.
Well, I think it's one of those things too where it's like, as I wash, like we're adding more ice and that ice melts, so it's like we end up like at the end of like the first wash, say like when we recirculate the water back, I'll have more water than when I started with just naturally. So we'll just fill up sort of what we need, and then we'll drain to waste the last little bit. So then like, even though each wash goes on, it's still getting fresh water added back to it. So it's not like you're just washing in the same dirty water. It gets dirty, and then it almost like dilutes back to cleaner, and then dirty again, cleaner. So yeah.
I'm going to ask each of you your thoughts or methodologies as far as water movement. Spencer touched on it earlier with one directional, something that I think Frenchie Cannoli first focused on, and I know MTS Farms has provided a lot of feedback on. How do you guys like to move the water to separate the resin from the stock? And have you ever played around with one directional water movement on an entire wash? Nick, let's start with you.
I haven't done the one directional yet myself. I don't really have a specific SOP or rhyme or reason for my washing. It's more or less a feel in that batch that I'm working with that day. Sometimes most of my washes, my first initial washes will be anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes if I'm working with outdoor material and I don't know that the condition that it was growing in. Then it ups from there from anywhere between 6 to 10 minutes for the rest of my washes. I might do a back and forth agitation that goes between 2 to 3 minutes per direction, but it's kind of just the way that I'm feeling. I switch arms every couple of minutes. I'll switch directions every couple of minutes. There's nothing really specific about my process in that manner.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of the one direction in the Osprey anyways. I've found it just, things come out a little bit cleaner. There's not as much like jostling back and forth. So, and it's easier to do in the machine. I think, I'm looking for that right, the Osprey has, you can set and program recipes in there. I've never done it. So it's kind of the same as Nick. Like I'm looking for that right amount of spin. I want that material to be moving at just kind of like what I'm comfortable with after washing a bunch. There's a certain vortex I want, so I won't necessarily like program a recipe. I'm just kind of looking at it, and I'll ramp that speed up or down if I need to. With the Osprey, it's a little easier because if you have it running too fast, it kind of cavitates. Oh, it's too fast. Turn it down a little bit, But do it. After running it a bunch, that doesn't happen that often. So even with the machine, I kind of do it more on like a eyeball and hand feel still. Like I don't program recipes into it because every batch is different.
I think depending on the machine, you're going to get different movement of your flour. So if you look at the Osprey, for example, it's got the square corners. I think if you run that in one direction, if you look at the movement the flour has coming up, it's spinning. Like it's the water is reaching what it wants to reach. Whereas the Icon, I go in both directions because it's a circle, and you just don't see, you see the vortex, but you don't see that flour in it spinning around in the water like you do with the square machine.
Yeah, the way it turns over on itself. I see that.
I think it's incredible that JP Toro's here. That's insane. No, seriously, because
Shout out JB.
Americans are spoiled because you guys get everything. Nobody comes to Canada, so if you ever come to Canada, I got you. I move water. There's ice in it.
Ice, water, heat, pressure.
What about you, Adam?
We do not do One Direction currently, but that's for like a couple of reasons. The first, shouts out to Harry Styles, One Direction, but we're processing for other people, so they really care about their yields, obviously. So I would like to.
Yeah, let's swap out your mic. That mic doesn't seem to be working well.
Ask Mikey a question. He's willing to answer.
Is a wild MTS Toshi's in the crowd?
So you've done a lot of the One Direction. You're talking a lot about that, right? Have you been able to wash any batches yet back to back with going one direction versus going back and forth in multiple directions and seeing a difference in yields or quality for that matter?
Mikey Toshi's, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, I have. I've done that with Straw Grease Willie. Same batch, same grow, same tech, everything like that, and done back to back. And I was able to get a little bit higher percentage. And I feel like where you see the quality is really in the end batches. So like in your fourth or fifth wash, whatever you're taking it to, you're seeing way less contaminant there if you're doing the One Direction. Now that was hand washed and bruteless. One thing about it being hand wash is you want a smooth-sided vessel. So if you're washing in a brute can, even those edges on the side, it's going to be sloshing stuff around. You're not going to create as good of a vortex. In my opinion, the vortex is what's actually removing the heads. Because although it's flowing within the water, you're still creating areas of pressure within that water that should be able to pull a head off of a stock. So, yep. But yeah, as far as machines go, I have more testing to do. Everything that I've heard back from other people is positive.
We do One Direction sometimes on our later washes to try to keep it from getting too beat up. But yeah, what I was trying to say was like because we process mostly for other people, it's like the yield on that first pull is very important to them. So I can't really fuck around. I've also found, especially in the machines, like especially the rounded ones, like the hashtag, like the first wash takes a little bit of time to get going unless you use like almost like an overkill amount of water. So like a one direction on a first wash would probably make like beautiful melt, but it wouldn't yield as much as like my people are used to. So it's that fine dance of quality and yield that we're trying to do.
We got time for one more question. Jonah, you're loud enough, man. Just yell.
I think if you have, if you have terpenes or that expressing itself even more so with reusing that water, then you're probably washing too aggressively and you're breaking heads open at that point in time. So you shouldn't smell it as much or even see if you get like an oil slick. I think that might be due to more agitation more than anything else. I just know that there's a certain amount of solid material that water can physically hold. I just don't know what that number is or how to figure. But also, like Adam said, you're essentially, when you are reusing your water, you're not using 100% of your reused or recycled water. It's like a ratio. It's 25% reused water and then 75% fresh water. So reusing your water makes sense, especially if you're trying to save on consumption and also maintain temperatures a lot better, if you don't have a chiller. That helps. I mean, that's your overhead right here. It lowers your overhead. It's a good question. You have anything,
Lindsay?
I could teach you guys how to recover terpenes from a freeze dryer if you're worried about losing them.
That's tomorrow.
Yeah, I was
think
gonna
that's
say
tomorrow.
that's a future panel.
So there's a few arguments. So for example, if you're using RO water, which a lot of people do, I think RO water is pretty aggressive. If it's stripping things like copper lines, what's it doing to our terpenes? So and then the flip side of that is if I have water saturated with terpenes, are those terpenes then acting as a solvent in extracting more terpenes? So there's two kind of lines of thoughts to that, and I think I'm not sure if anybody's done the work to get the answer.
I think that's fair. We've got time for one more question before we head into dinner. I just want to remind everybody that this is just a dabbing event, so we're not consuming flour inside. Specifically, we've got the judging coming up, and we're going to be judging everybody's hash throughout the weekend. So we're just going to keep it to dabbing. So if you're smoking flour, we just ask you to do it outside. But if anybody has one more question before these guys, go ahead. I'm gonna kibosh this question because we're gonna tackle this head on tomorrow. So that's its own segment. So we got time for another question. Did you have one, right?
What is your views on wash times and how many washes are you doing basically? Are you washing 3 or 10 minutes? And do you think that makes end result difference? And how do you go about handling
I think it definitely does, and I'm sure all of us up here have our own specific set parameters that we base it off of. But for me personally, I allow the material that I'm washing in that specific batch at any given time tell me what's happening and what the resin produces in each bag. If I'm pulling all 8 bags, if I'm doing a full spec, doesn't matter. But I do have a standard time frame that I work around, and I'll adjust accordingly for that particular workday. But essentially, I do like a 20 to 30 minute soak time. And usually my first wash is fairly quick. Like I said, if I'm working with outdoor or light depth, not knowing about its environmental situations, indoor, slightly different because it's going to be usually a more cleaner product that you're working with as far as washing. And for me, I'm on the school of thought of your first pull not always necessarily being your best pull. I think you can get cleaner pulls too with your second or third, also depending on how you agitate. But also how many times you wash is, for me, I don't tell anybody there's a specific number. It's not, you don't wash only 3 times for every strain that you do. The resin will show itself, and when it's done, it's done. But there's also a fine line between washing too aggressively, too fast, over a long period of time versus short. So I'm sure these people have something to say about that.
Kind of the same way. I'll usually, depending on what I'm doing too, like if I want to pull melt, I'm gonna do a shorter, gentler wash. But for the most part, I want to pull quality, so I'm gonna kind of do maybe like a 10 to 15 minute first wash, and then after each cycle, I'm pulling a little chunk out and just throwing it under my microscope and seeing how many heads are left on it. Or like maybe after the second or third wash, I'll do that and see like, oh, okay. And then after a while, you get a feeling of like, all right, the material's still floating, or a lot of it's sinking and it's oversaturated or whatever. So some of it might be done in 3 washes. Some of it sometimes might take 6. But for like the first couple, my goal is to pull quality. So I'm kind of, keeping things a little more controlled in those first couple washes, and then if it looks like it's got a bunch of heads on it on that third or fourth wash, I might spin it a little harder or a little longer, and then you just kind of get an idea working with each individual strain too, is how it wants to react. And my idea is I want to get all that resin off in as little amount of time and in as little wash cycles as possible. So it's just being efficient about it.
Yeah, I would say use a mic if it's material you're washing for the first time. Use a microscope every pull and see what you're doing. I think there's guys that won't need to do this, but that's the best way, especially if you're training in a new team of young guys. You want them to know what it looks like. You want them to know what good resin is versus contaminated resin, and that's the best way to train your team, I would say.
Guys, give it up for the second panel, Melting of the Heads. So we've got a beautiful dinner for you. It looks like it's all ready. Adam, can you tell the people what you've prepared and what they're about to experience?
We brought in some barbecue from John Brown's Smokehouse. Got a nice cornucopia of meats and sides and pretty much everything I think you guys would want or need. So I hope you guys enjoy the delicious smoked meats.
So we're gonna get everybody to line up, starting like you were coming in, and then we're gonna work our way this way. We know it's tight in here. We appreciate your guys' patience and sort of just watching the shoulder room as we move through.